New research is changing everything we thought we knew about choline's impact on the cow and her calf, and top scientists have a lot to say about it. They are presenting new research that supports choline as a required nutrient to optimize milk production, choline as a required nutrient to support a healthy transition, choline as a required nutrient to improve calf health and growth, and choline as a required nutrient to increase colostrum quantity. This new research is solidifying choline's role as a required nutrient for essentially every cow, regardless of health status, milk production level, or body condition score. Learn more about the science that is changing the game and the choline source that is making it happen. Reassure precision-release choline from Balchem. Visit balchem.com/scientistsay to learn more.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Real Science Lecture Series. My name is Scott Sorrell. I'm the Director of Global Marketing at Balchem. Today, we welcome back Dr. Laura Hernandez from the University of Wisconsin to explore the role of mammary gland in governing calcium metabolism. Dr. Laura Hernandez is a professor in the Animal and Dairy Science Department at the University of Wisconsin. She received her PhD from the University of Arizona. Her area of research has focused on how serotonin controls the mammary gland and various aspects of lactation. Dr. Hernandez combines basic research from the cell to the whole animal level in a variety of mammalian species in order to broaden the focus on the importance of the mammary gland and its contribution to and regulation of successful lactation in dairy cattle. She specifically focuses on the interaction of serotonin and calcium metabolism during the transition period. Her research has determined that serotonin is an important regulator of mammary gland and maternal calcium homeostasis during lactation. Dr. Hernandez, welcome to the Real Science Lecture Series. Take it away.
Thank you. And thank you to everyone for coming today. I hope to introduce you to some new concepts related to mammary gland, the role of the mammary gland in governing calcium. We have done quite a bit of research over the years, and we've come to some fundamental, interesting conclusions thus far, and I hope that they'll be helpful for you and for the field of transition cow health. So we know that the status of the calcium of a dairy cow during the periparturient period fluctuates. And these are largely based on serum calcium concentrations, which are difficult to determine, but do give us information on how the cow behaves and how she might go on to have a successful or potentially not a successful lactation. So here we have in green what we would call a normal calcemic cow during the transition period. You can see she decreases and then she's going to increase and get to a normal level of calcium homeostasis. In the yellow line, this is depicted as to what we would call subclinical hypocalcemia around calving. And then in the blue line, we have what we would classify as hypocalcemic or clinical hypocalcemic cows. So there are several factors that are going to contribute to the regulation of the status of the cow during this time frame. It's not just all dependent on what her status is at calving, but rather where she is prior to calving and where she is 24 to maybe 96 hours postpartum. So in trying to assess how a herd is doing, we have to understand what the magnitude of the drop of calcium is at calving. As you can see here, all cows do experience a drop, but it's the level of the drop that can really predispose a cow to having issues. And we'll talk about that in a little bit later part of the presentation. We also have what's called the duration of the drop. How long are the cows low? Low at the level of the clinical hypocalcemia or even low at the level of subclinical. And then how fast do they recover? This is really critical because sometimes cows will drop and rebound quite quickly and be just fine, but sometimes it does take them quite a long period of time to get back to normal calcemic levels. And then finally, what we're all trying to solve is how to make them resistant to this very large drop in calcium that we really are trying to avoid in order for them to have a healthy and successful transition period and productive lifespan. So I approach this from the level of the mammary gland. I am a mammary gland biologist, and what we do know across all species is that the mammary gland controls milk synthesis, and this is related to the need to produce more milk. And in species where you have the offspring interacting with the animal, this is driven by the offspring's input to the mammary gland. We know that colostrum and milk synthesis in terms of dairy cattle is really critical, the colostrum for the calf, but in general, we want to make sure that the cow gets off to a good start and is making adequate milk. And every time we remove milk from the cow, she has to figure out how to make more milk, since essentially all milk is going to be produced within the tissue except about 50% of the fat, which comes from the diet. So every time we make milk, we need more protein. We need, in some cases, to get it from the diet. However, the muscle is also going to be contributing amino acids if it needs to. It will release amino acids to make milk. And then this will go and contribute to the production of milk, as I mentioned. Further, there's going to be a demand by the adipose tissue when the cow needs more energy. Sometimes in the case of de novo fatty acid synthesis for those medium and short chain fatty acids. And then you're going to have, at times, really substantial mobilization of NEFA and BHBAs depending on the time period of the cow's life. Particularly, you will see a really robust increase in these metabolites during the early lactation period when the cow is having to make a lot of milk and she's switching out of that pregnancy phase. And also, the demand for calcium is quite large, and species are going to have to be reliant on their bone tissue, and in the case of the dairy cow, for quite a period of time until the cow reaches what we call normal calcemic status, where she can totally rely on her diet for enough calcium to be going into the milk. So the bone will be mobilized in addition to the increase in absorption of calcium from the diet that is going to be provided by what the cow is eating. So this mammary gland input is really critical because every time we make a milking event, there will be more milk produced, and the cow is going to have to deal with what she's eating and if that's enough or not enough, and then also providing whatever she may have in her body to make up or compensate for this should she not have enough provided in her diet. So just to prove a point here, in terms of how milk synthesis controls calcium decline at parturition, this was a study conducted by Dr. Jesse Goff and published in 2002, where they were able to take cows and mastectomize them prior to calving. So the cows were pregnant, and about 60 days prepartum, they removed the udder. And in the other half of the cows, they went on and calved, but they had their udder present. And what you can see here in the green line, this is going to be the normal cows. They're going to have a decrease in blood calcium concentrations at calving, and then they go up to get normal calcemic around 48 hours postpartum. The cows, however, that did not have their udder intact, you can see here that there's not really any change in calcium around parturition, and that is because there is no calcium going to the milk. It is just whatever was going to the calf at the end of the pregnancy, and then postpartum, there is no need to divert that calcium to the mammary gland. And so what this shows you here, as highlighted, if you have an udder, you're going to have a decrease in calcium. So the calcium is pulling calcium from the body of the cow to make milk. And then in the cows where there is no udder to make milk, you're going to have a normal calcemic status. And this is just really highlights that there is not, the cow is not able to regulate her calcium metabolism at calving when she is having to make milk. So what we know here is that over the course of a lactation cycle, you're going to have milk yield achieving peak at some point between 60 to 90 days postpartum. And after that period of time, you're going to exhibit a decrease in milk yield. And what we can see here is that calcium supply is in a negative balance during this time frame in which the cow is trying to achieve maximal milk production. And then around anywhere from 150 to 200 days, the cow is going to get to where she has plenty of calcium coming from her diet, and she's not going to really be mobilizing bone tissue. So there's this period of negative calcium imbalance that is always going to occur. And when this happens is going to be different for every cow, but this is really how we know whether the cow is having to mobilize calcium or if she's getting sufficient calcium from her diet. So in the skeleton, this is the main source of calcium. And in the case of a dairy cow, you're going to have anywhere from 8 to 8.5 kilos of calcium that is there. And so this is going to be able to provide the supplemental calcium that the cow needs while sustaining milk production until she's able to achieve the ability to use only dietary calcium to meet her maintenance requirements as well as the fetal requirements if she's pregnant again. So how does this happen? What we know is that in non-pregnant states, so just your average cow hanging out, living her life, she's going to have these parathyroid glands, which is where a hormone called parathyroid hormone, or PTH, is going to be secreted. And what it does is when calcium decreases below the threshold, it'll be secreted. It will increase calcium resorption from the urine at the level of the kidneys, so you're going to have less calcium excreted. And then it's also going to work at the level of the intestine to increase absorption of calcium from the diet. And vitamin D is going to be involved here in regulating this increased calcium absorption due to PTH and other mechanisms. And in this case, in normal physiology, very rarely do you have to rely on calcium resorption to make up or compensate for that decrease in blood calcium. The diet and the decrease of excretion of calcium are enough to keep things in check. In lactation, however, this is a different time frame in what we kind of call a supraphysiological state, and you have an added stressor of the mammary gland where milk is being produced. So there are supplemental mechanisms that occur in order to keep the normal mechanisms working okay so that everyone can work for a shared common goal. So the mammary gland will secrete what's called parathyroid hormone-related protein, or PTHRP, also called PTHLH, parathyroid-like hormone, and that'll work at the level of the bone to increase calcium resorption. So this will occur in tandem with PTH, increasing calcium resorption and increasing calcium absorption by the gut, and having an increase in vitamin D. Because simply these normal mechanisms in which we saw during the normal physiological state aren't quite enough to help the cow keep things in check in her body while also maintaining milk production levels. So how do we know that this is a reality? In a study completed in rats, they were able to take these lactating rats and either remove their parathyroid glands or keep their parathyroid glands intact. And what you see here is that the calcium concentrations stay normal even in the rats with no parathyroid hormone. So why would that be? So in this case, what they did was they took the femur bones of these rats, and what we have here is the parathyroid gland in a non-lactating rat. This is what their femur ash is. So that's the amount of calcium and phosphorus in the bone. In the lactating rats that had their parathyroid gland, there's a reduction, as one would expect, because you're taking calcium from the bone to help them. And also, when you remove the parathyroid gland, this is equal to what you see in the rats with the intact glands, suggesting that something else is happening. And that work subsequently led to the work that showed that there was an additional hormone coming from the mammary gland. So we really have to have this secondary mechanism present to maintain calcium status. So what does this all have to do for dairy cows? Work out of Jessica McCart's lab showed that there were different classifications of dairy cows postpartum and how this related to not only their milk production, which we have here, but also to other health events. And so what you have here is week relative to calving on the X and milk production in kilos on the Y-axis. And the gray line is an indicator of cows that had a normal calcemic transition period. So they had total calcium concentrations that were normal day 1 and day 4 in milk. But you can see that they still have a decrease at calving relative to where they were prior to calving. And these are these gray bars here. So this is their milk production level. We then had a classification of cows that she termed transient subclinical hypocalcemia. And that are these orange bars, and that you can see this up here. And these cows had a decrease to below the subclinical threshold at day 1 postpartum, but not day 4 postpartum. So that gets to this recovery. They were normal 4 days postpartum. And what you can see here is that their line is at the highest level of milk production across this lactation cycle. She also has cows that she refers to as persistent subclinical hypocalcemia. So they were subclinical at both day 1 and day 4 postpartum. So these are those cows that are still not recovering that we talked about earlier on. And their milk yield is actually between the normal calcemic and the transient hypocalcemic cows. And then finally, you have these cows that were normal at calving. However, they go decreased at day 4 postpartum, and they have the lowest milk yield of the 4 groups. And this is likely due to some situation where maybe a treatment didn't work, or their delta really changed across the transition period. There's a lot of reasons that could happen. So this suggests that the transient subclinical cows really are kind of get off and running, and they produce quite a bit of milk. And in the end, they're quite healthy. And one thing that we note is that the measurement of calcium at these different time points could really upset the natural rhythm of the cow, because typically if someone saw this transient subclinical hypocalcemia upon measurement of blood, it's possible they could treat the cow, and that may not be necessary. So we really have to look at the cows more holistically before making these treatment or prevention decisions. So in studies that we performed, which is in much more intensive studies, it really, what we saw was in alignment with Jess McCart's group, in which they had the more epidemiological picture. In a study that we just published, we had treatment groups of cows that were receiving a negative DCAD diet prepartum, or a positive DCAD prepartum. You can see here the lime green line are the negative DCAD cows, and the purple line are the positive DCAD cows. At parturition, we either infused them with calcium gluconate, or we gave them a saline treatment, allowing them to have their natural decrease in calcium postpartum. And what we saw here was a couple of things. One, the negative DCAD cows had higher calcium concentrations at calving, but they still had a decrease from where they were prepartum. And the positive DCAD cows had lower total ionized calcium concentration concentrations starting prior to parturition, and were lower for a longer period of time postpartum. But most interestingly, what we found was in the cows where we maintained eucalcemia at parturition for 24 hours, these cows that were fed negative DCAD diet actually had the lowest, the most persistent decrease in blood calcium concentrations postpartum. And we can see that here with the red line. These were the negative DCAD cows that received calcium. They have a delay in their decrease in calcium after we terminated the infusions, and it took them longer to get to normal calcemia compared to the 4 treatment groups. And so what this demonstrated was 2 things. One, you need a natural decrease in calcium at parturition, and 2, that it's possible that maintenance of calcium status at during the 24 hours postpartum could interfere with the prepartum diet of negative DCAD, which we're using to prevent really severe hypocalcemia. And so while this was a very intensive study, it does suggest a lot of interactions between how we feed cows prepartum and what we do in the 24 hours postpartum and what is natural for a cow overall. So how does transient hypocalcemia work and how do we manage it? That is the million-dollar question. So there are several prepartum strategies to modulate calcium homeostasis available. The most tried and true to this point are the negative DCAD diets, of which there are a lot of different available sources for this, and are also done sometimes by nutritionists by just acidifying the diet with various mineral mixtures, ultrachlor, soy chlor, biochlor, animate, etc. And that is where we're manipulating the positive ions in the diet and the negative ions in the diet to induce what we call a metabolic acidosis, which increases the excretion of calcium into the urine and stimulates this negative regulation of calcium homeostasis. There are calcium binders. One of them is synthetic sodium aluminum silicate that's available. Exolate is what the trade name is, and there have been other ones out there, but this is the primary one that's being used in the US. And there are other calcium chelators that can be used. And there are also EGTA calcium, which is what I'm going to talk about, that we use experimentally. And there are also attempts at making low potassium diets in order to decrease the amount of ions in the diet. However, that's much more difficult with alfalfa, at least in the Midwest. So what have we been utilizing? As I said, I'm going to focus on the first three because we've done experiments with all of them. And I'd like to propose how the mammary gland is really driving this. So what do calcium chelators do? What they do is they're going to bind calcium in the circulation and prevent it from being utilized. And there are both what we call EGTA or EDTA. EGTA primarily binds to calcium, while EDTA binds both calcium and magnesium. So it's impossible to separate the effects of both of those when you utilize that molecule. So we use EGTA in all of our experiments. So in this case, we infuse EGTA into the cow, we drive her calcium concentrations down, and as a result, we get increased calcium reabsorption by the kidney, we stimulate vitamin D synthesis, we increase PTH, we increase potentially calcium resorption, and also calcium absorption by the gut. So in a study in which we infused EGTA during the early lactation period between days 5 to 15 in milk, where we were trying to understand what was happening in the dairy cow, we found out a few really cool things. So in this study, we had a group of cows that were either non-lactating in red, or they were between days 5 and 15 in milk in blue. And they were either given this EGTA chelation for 24 hours and maintained at subclinical hypocalcemic levels, or they were given a saline infusion as a control. So what you can see here in the blue, we have the saline cows. This is ionized calcium on the y-axis, and hours here relative to the start of the infusion on the y-axis, on the x-axis. And what you can see here is that we were able to drive calcium down in both the non-lactating and the lactating cows, and we were able to maintain calcium homeostasis using saline. We found out something interesting, though, because remember, these non-lactating cows, they were both non-lactating and non-pregnant, so they should just be making normal milk. Their calcium should be normal because they're not making milk, like I discussed earlier on. And so what we saw was that these lactating EGTA cows required a lot more EGTA to stay at a subclinical calcium level than the non-lactating cows. And this really, again, solidified the work that Jesse Goff had done, saying that the mammary gland is having some interaction with the cow in terms of making milk. And we were able to show that this is true for calcium in this study. So remember, we're having to give a lot more EGTA and a lot more over time to drive those calcium concentrations down to a subclinical threshold compared to these non-lactating cows where we were able to almost maintain constant rate of infusion. So then we wanted to test this prepartum. Would this EGTA chelation work similar to giving like an exolate? Would it work like a DCAD, or is the biology different and all three of them are manipulating calcium different to have good calcium status and production postpartum? So we performed a study in which all cows were enrolled at 28 days prepartum. We collected daily blood and urine samples, and about day 7 relative to parturition, plus or minus 3 days, we began treating these cows daily with EGTA for 6 hours, and we were maintaining them just above in the subclinical calcium range. We took hourly blood samples during that time, and then we took a host of blood and urine samples after that. Again, with the goal to understand if we just bind calcium, how is that different than if we use a calcium binder or a DCAD diet on the homeostasis of the dairy cow. So we could figure out how these mechanisms actually work. So postpartum, thankfully, treating with EGTA increased calcium concentrations. Postpartum, this is beginning at calving 12 hours postpartum, and then 24, 48, and 36, where we get to where they're equal calcium concentrations. So our goal was achieved. And what was interesting though here, this is showing how we induce subclinical hypocalcemia and how the infusion rates changed. So what you can see here is that we induced the subclinical hypocalcemia as we had intended in these cows. But what was interesting was that by the time we had given a couple of infusions of EGTA, the cows were almost requiring an open line to keep them at a subclinical level, which suggested that both the draw on the mammary gland for colostrum and potentially to the calf as well, the cow is fighting that. She's trying to protect her ability to maintain the calf, but also potentially to make milk. And so her body's really being challenged, but she wants to keep the calcium for herself. Which in of itself is interesting and also supports the hypothesis that a pregnant cow is not a lactating cow, is not a non-pregnant cow. All these cows are different. They respond differently to things, and we have to feed and treat them differently based on where they're at in their life cycle. So you can't really have a one-size-fits-all approach for these girls in order to keep them moving as we want them to so they can be healthy and successful. So what we saw was that initially milk yield decreased in EGTA, but we saw no differences by 30 in the 305 milk yield. So that early postpartum period, the EGTA cows had lower milk production than the cows that were given the control, but overall, up to this point, we're still collecting some data on this. We have not seen any differences in milk yield. So it's possible that she was able to transition a little better than if we had just allowed them to overstimulate themselves. But we have a lot more questions surrounding the findings we had here. And this just shows you the overall production of these cows up to this point. So they're just below 15,000 kilos of milk production in a 305. So our next question after looking at EGTA, which was specific to calcium, was how do calcium binders and negative DCAD impact calcium homeostasis? And was it equal to what we see in the EGTA, or are the mechanisms different? And this becomes important, as I said, because if they don't act the same, we have to not treat them the same postpartum, and we have to manage them a little bit differently. So we performed quite a large study in transition dairy cows. There were about 40 cows per treatment group, and they were either assigned to a diet of control, low potassium forage diet, a negative DCAD diet, or an exolate diet. And the exolate that was being used is what was on the label, and we were targeting about a negative 80 DCAD was our goal. So cows were enrolled at 28 days prepartum. They were body condition scored, ultrasound for their back fat. We took daily blood samples, and then we were taking individual intakes in the Incentec feeders up until they calved. We collected blood, urine, saliva, feed intake, and in a subset of cows, 8 cows per treatment, we collected fecal samples over a 3-day period to determine what minerals were being excreted into the feces. Postpartum, we took a lot of blood samples and urine samples. That's what we do, as well as their saliva, because we were really trying to get at the physiology of what was happening in the cows. So we did see alterations in serum calcium across the transition period. The red bar is the exolate, the blue is the DCAD, and the yellow is the control diet. Day relative to parturition on the X and serum calcium on the Y. And you can see here, starting 14 days prepartum, they had been on the diet approximately 21 days. At this point, concentrations of calcium were already higher in the exolate cows. They had a smaller decrease in calcium at calving, and most of them did not even become subclinically hypocalcemic. And then they rebounded much quicker than either the DCAD or the control. The DCAD also had less of a decrease than the control diet. So it worked as what it was supposed to do, which was reduce the decrease in calcium at parturition. And then the control had the most severe drop in calcium. In terms of salivary calcium, and in this case, we were trying to understand where the minerals were going. The exolate cows appeared to have a little bit higher of calcium in their saliva prepartum, which is in line with what we see here with the blood. And then postpartum, everything equals out. And the urine calcium concentrations were elevated in the DCAD cows, as one would expect, because the premise of that diet is to cause increased secretion of calcium as part of the metabolic acidosis. The control and the exolate were the same. And then at calving, within a day, all diets were excreting calcium to the same extent. In terms of phosphorus, and this was a question that had been brought up because exolate cows at times have been deemed hypophosphatemic, and we know that their serum phosphorus concentrations are lower compared to DCAD or control cows. We did observe this just like other studies, but once the diet changed to the lactating diet, these cows rebounded in their serum phosphorus concentrations, and then they evened out to normal. The control and DCAD cows had a decrease at calving, as one would expect, and then they evened out within a day or two postpartum. In terms of the salivary phosphorus, the exolate cows had low salivary phosphorus, so it didn't appear that the saliva was capturing the phosphorus that was being decreased. We didn't really see changes in the DCAD cows or the control cows, although the DCAD cows had some elevated salivary phosphorus compared to the controls. And when we looked at the urine phosphorus, the DCAD cows also had higher urine phosphorus, again, as one would expect based on the type of diet being fed. However, we saw no differences between the control and exolate cows prepartum. And this was interesting because these three variables suggested to us that the phosphorus had to be going somewhere, and we weren't sure where it was going because it was decreased in both the serum and the saliva. So this took us to fecal mineral digestibility. In this case, when we looked at the mineral digestibility, we saw no differences. Again, this was only performed in a subset of the cows, 8 per treatment group. However, when we analyzed the water extractable phosphorus, we did see an increase in phosphorus in this component in the exolate-fed cows, suggesting that there's a certain amount of the exolate that is just heading out into the feces that has not even been absorbed. And this is a test that's typically done on manure and in water to determine if there's phosphorus building up in that component by typically soil labs. So this suggested to us that there was a proportion of the exolate that just was not getting utilized by the cow that was being excreted. So our hypothesis after the termination of the study was that cows receiving exolate, in this case, the exolate binds positive ions, and it appears that it binds phosphorus to a higher extent potentially than was thought, but it also binds magnesium and phosphorus and calcium. And what we saw was that there's an increase in calcium postpartum, but there was this decrease. There's an increase in calcium upon feeding the diet, but there's a decrease in phos and mag. When we saw the saliva, there was an increase in calcium and magnesium of the saliva, but a decrease in phosphorus, similar to what was observed in the blood. In terms of the urine, they were all equal in the urine. And in terms of the digestive tract, they were equal, but it's really what is going out into the feces that was being increased. So there was just an amount entering the feces that was not being absorbed. And so this was the first time proposing some kind of mechanism of where that phosphorus is actually going when we see that decrease in blood phosphorus that was consistently observed. So our hypothesis is that in a negative DCAD cow, what you're seeing is this metabolic acidosis. And in that situation, you get more PTH, increased calcium reabsorption, more vitamin D, and this is prepartum when this is being fed. That allows for more calcium reabsorption from the bone and absorption in the gut. And a zeolite-fed cow or any kind of sodium silicate clay fed cow, there's this decrease in calcium, phosphorus, and mag in the diet. So you have reduced phosphorus and potentially acting through this hormone called FGF23, although we don't have data to prove that yet because the assays are not good for this. So hopefully one day we will be able to determine if that's truly the mechanism. And that is going to increase 1-alpha hydroxylase and vitamin D3, decreasing phosphorus excretion into the urine, more calcium absorption in the gut, and more calcium resorption from the bone, leading to improved calcium status postpartum. And that in EGTA, this is working only through binding calcium. You get decreased calcium in the cow prepartum. And in this case, you're getting more 125 D3 being produced, more calcium reabsorption at the level of the urine, more PTH, potentially more serotonin and PTH-LH from the mammary gland as well, stimulating calcium resorption from the bone and more absorption by the gut, leading to calcium statuses being normal postpartum. They all achieve the same thing, but they work differently. And that's important because when we look at a dairy cow postpartum, we want to make sure that we're managing her appropriately. So we just performed a recent study, and this is new preliminary data. So we have a lot left to do here. But in this case, all of our cows were fed a negative DCAD diet. We took samples of urine and blood daily. And then at parturition, we either maintain them normal calcemic as we did in my earlier study, or we maintain them in a level of transient hypocalcemia. And then we have a control group, which would be your normal transition out of parturition to determine how these cows respond, how they go back on feed, what their physiology is, and try to separate out how long do they need to be transient. If we prevent any transient hypocalcemia, do they have a negative response physiologically? And what is the natural status? And so our preliminary data, we were able to do this. So we have our normal calcemic cows here in the maroon, our control cows in the lighter orange yellow, and then in the orange we have our EGTA cows for 24 hours postpartum. So we were able to maintain these three groups. And our preliminary data, all were equal on day one milk production, but it looks like the EGTA cows might be producing more milk 21 days postpartum. We're still following these cows, and we're trying to understand their biology better so that we can better inform producers and nutritionists of how and what to look for with these cows, and how we can help them to let them have their natural status and be as healthy as possible. So my hypothesis is that there's this blood calcium that is circulating. You add the mammary gland in milk production, you're going to have calcium entering the mammary gland to go into secretion of milk for the production of colostrum and mature milk up to peak. This then results in the stimulation of negative feedback mechanisms so that we can have adequate calcium for the dairy cow, and she's able to make more milk and be healthy throughout her lactation cycle. So my conclusions are that early lactation cows are equipped to maintain their calcemic status when challenged with hypocalcemia, and the mechanisms are unique, and there's a lot of cow-to-cow variation. And there's a possibility for genetic inputs that we have yet to explore, but there is some data out there that suggests that there are some things to look at. But they do have the ability to do this as long as we take care of them. A certain level of decreased calcium at parturition is necessary. So we don't want to prevent it. We don't want them to be in a straight line like we saw in Jesse Goff's work. We do need a decrease to activate their homeostatic mechanisms in order to have this adequate calcium concentration. And this is termed transient hypocalcemia, as Jessica McCart has seen. It is critical to manage the prepartum cow in order to ensure proper homeostasis postpartum. And all ways are appropriate. It's just understanding the biology of each way or what you're doing and how it affects the cow postpartum that is critical, so you know how to handle her, because these cows are all different and the physiology is different. And so it's important to know what to look for and how to treat them. We really are aiming to determine what these relationships are at calving, so that we can identify what is a healthy transition to lactation as it relates to calcium, so that the data is out there. My goal is to provide the physiology to you all so that you're able to take a look at it and make decisions that are appropriate. And different prepartum interventions work differently, as do postpartum treatments. And so understanding how they work together are super critical to taking care of your cows and making sure they're healthy and they make it through a successful 305. So with that, I have to thank all of my funding and all of my students. I have a lot of crazy ideas, as you saw, lots of crazy studies, but really I've had amazing students that work in my lab, and they're always on board to try something new. So I have to thank them for all their hard work. And with that, I can take any questions.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Hernandez. Before we get started answering those questions, we'd like to share a brief video, and then we'll be right back to answer the questions submitted during today's presentation.
The economics of feeding Reassure precision release choline.
Reassure is fed during the transition period, And because it's fed for such a short period of time, it costs just $15 per cow. And yet the benefits will continue to generate income throughout the year. Cows fed ReaShure produce 5 pounds more colostrum, which pays for your ReaShure investment on the very first day of lactation. Cows fed ReaShure also produce 5 pounds more milk per day, every day. That means after the first day, every day is payday. Invest in ReaShure during the transition period and recoup your investment on the very first day of lactation. After that, you got it, payday. All right, as a reminder, you can still submit questions through the Q&A tab at the top of your screen. Dr. Hernandez, your first question comes in from Louise. It says, regarding Jessica McArt's work on calcium dynamics, why do you think the milk yield was lower for cows with delayed subclinical hypocalcemia than cows with persistent subclinical hypocalcemia? I would have thought that persistent subclinical hypocalcemic cows would have had a lower milk yield due to their consistently lower calcium concentration compared to those that of the delayed cows.
That's a great question, and thank you for it. At this time, I don't think there's like a data explanation thus far, but I would say that probably a couple things are going on. There's potential disease implications that occur there, whether it's DA or metritis or something else that could be overlaid with those two different types of animals. And then in terms of the delayed cows, I suspect that they're having some kind of inability to actually activate their mechanisms for feedback. So if they're fine at parturition, there's this delay in ability to activate PTH or vitamin D or these other hormonal mechanisms that are going to get them back to normal. And I think you'd have to really go out and look at their calcium levels later and potential disease implications later. But I think there's this shift in ability to regulate themselves that occurs. Whereas the more like persistent cows, there's probably some kind of disease state possibly that's interacting there. So that's my hypothesis anyway.
All right, thank you for that. Mahmoud would like to know, is there a relationship between calcium withdrawal from the bone compared to body condition score? Is there a relationship?
Oh, that's a great question. One I really wish I could answer. There is an interaction between obesity and bone. And so this is harder to get out in cows because access to a DEXA or a scanner for a cow's bone tissue is really hard, and getting at the grams of calcium per se that are coming out of bone are difficult in terms of without ashing a cow and taking a biopsy and really doing repeated measures. But we do know that like in obese individuals, there's less bone mass. There's also less muscle mass. So there's definitely a possibility that cows that have higher body condition score could have less bone mass that could impact their ability to use that or have less calcium to support them. But there's a real relationship, and there are some hormonal interactions as well from that perspective.
All right, I've got a question from Grant with respect to sodium aluminosilicate strategy. If FGF23 is not involved in P upregulation, then what other mechanism might be involved in regulating serum calcium before normal calcium homeostasis mechanisms kicks in?
I think that's the $1 million question. And without getting at FGF23, it's really hard for me to answer that. We do know that like phosphorus and calcium come together from the bone at a different ratio of 2-to-1. So it could be overstimulation of that in the relationship of calcium and phosphorus coming from potentially bone tissue. But beyond the FGF23, from what I can tell from the literature, I haven't been able to find anything else that's a surefire answer. The other part too is I have no idea, at least with the Exilate product, how preferential it is for phosphorus, mag, and calcium. So what the ratios are of how it binds. And I think that might be important information to help get at part of that question that you're asking. But it's not, I'm not privy to that.
All right, our next question comes in from Nicholas. You showed that Exilite is also binding phosphorus. Do you recommend low phosphorus strategies for pre-calving cows?
So there is data from Germany, I believe, where they fed really low phosphorus diets, and it seems to act like the Exilate. Like there's some real similarities in what that data set has. However, I think in that case, with just the low phosphorus diet, they did have some really negative impacts postpartum. So I think if you were going to do like a super low phosphorus, you'd have to really balance your other minerals to make sure that you didn't cause some other kind of problem.
Yeah. So you presented a few different strategies. Can you maybe kind of summarize some of those? How does the EGTA compare to the practical DCAD and Exilite supplementation on calcium?
EGTA is not practical at all. You have to give it IV. And the reason we use it is because we want to be able to make comparisons to what is calcium, right? Like calcium specifically. So it's not practical at all. It's just really a tool to understand the biology of affecting only calcium prepartum and trying to extrapolate what does negative DCAD do? What does phosphorus do? To take out some of those other variables. I mean, DCAD and Exilate are both ways to get a cow into normal calcemia. I would say understanding how they do that, it's quite different. As you see, we know DCAD causes a metabolic acidosis. We know how they rebound postpartum. We know how to intervene postpartum in terms of what happens to the cow should she be really ill and what those responses are. I think with the Exilate, we don't know all of those yet because we're learning what are all of the physiology components that are occurring. And I think that understanding it's more preferentially binding phosphorus and understanding how calcium changes or mag or how you give a bolus maybe, and what does that do to the cow who's been on Exilate versus DCAD. Those are all really important when making decisions postpartum of how and when to treat and how it might impact their milk yield, their health. And so that is really what we're just starting to pull apart. And I think now that we know that it largely works through phosphorus, we can understand better how to manage the cow postpartum and how long how she should actually eat the Exilate. That's another question because we know you can feed DCAD for longer periods of time, and it appears you can't really do that with Exilate. And so understanding that's really important even on the implementation prepartum of how you group cows, how you feed cows, what's the cost benefit ratio, and how you ensure you treat them appropriately after calving.
Okay, so the title of your talk was the role of the mammary gland in governing calcium metabolism. Can you kind of summarize that for us? What is the role of the mammary gland?
It controls it. Of course, I would say that, but we really show that time and again in terms of all of these nutrients. You milk an animal, you're going to stimulate some endocrine response and some nutritional shift because this stressor of making milk is not normal. And the cow is going to have to stay healthy while making milk. And every time we increase our milk yield or we put that stimulus on, you have to consider what's happening in the cow and where she is in her life. And that gets at what we should feed a cow at different times, how we should treat a cow at different times, because the biology is not the same. We can't just treat them all identical. And that's what I would hope that people would get from this is how do we plan our treatment and care of these cows and considering where she is in her life cycle.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Mark would like to know, do slow-release calcium boluses at calving delay natural PTH response?
I haven't personally used the boluses to measure PTH. We do know that it is going to increase calcium, and that's the goal, right? Is to bring calcium up with the boluses. My consideration when I think about this does the cow need it? So we have some clues, like, did she have issues in her previous lactation? Do we know she's going to make tons of milk when she calves in? Those might be ways to say, like, yeah, this is my third or fourth lactation cow. She's giving a ton of milk. I should give her a bolus because I know she's making a lot of milk. Those cows, like, that are coming into their second lactation likely don't need them unless something happens. And I'd say give her a day or two. And that's similar to what Jess McCart's data shows, is really it's not till 48 hours where you start to see problems, unless there's like an event, right? Or you know that she's making tons of milk in other lactations or had an issue in a previous lactation. So I think the blanket approach is hard because not all of them need it, and you might be preventing their PTH response. I would have to like measure PTH myself to tell you that. I've never done that before, but you could be prohibitive to a mechanism she needs to stimulate to have her natural transition into calcium status. And so I'd encourage people just to think about it from that perspective.
This has been a very interesting webinar, and it's obvious that we're learning a lot, but there's a lot left to learn. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about some of the next steps in the research and how long it might take us to get to a point where we can start making some solid recommendations?
I think we have good data for like the DCAD diets. Like, we've been using those long enough that we have some really good information. I think Jessica's making great progress in some of her epidemiological studies that will be really helpful to making some good decisions. We have a couple of projects too where we're trying to get at those further time points out so we can say, like, she's fine. We know PTH is good. Like, in this condition, we want to tell you that. And so I'm hoping in the next like couple of years that for sure, I know she's working on it. I'm working on it. Her and I exchange data all the time. It's exciting when a vet and a physiologist, like intense physiologist, find a lot of the same things. And so I'm hopeful. And what we keep seeing, though, is that the cow is largely okay. And we should give her 36 to 48 hours before we make a decision unless she's ill. And prepartum, I think we're making a lot of inroads on Exilate. We did an intense study. I think they're working hard to find more things out. And I'd say the DCAD groups have put a lot of effort into understanding the biology of that as well. And I think that's what's important, because the more we know, the more we can tell you all, and then you all can make decisions for what's right for the farmer and how you're feeding cows. And so that's my goal for you. And so I'm hoping in the next couple of years, we'll just keep pumping out more information for everybody.
Yeah. I know we're in the process of scheduling the follow-up podcast to this webinar. Are we going to invite Jess along to the pod?
We could certainly ask her. I know they were talking. Tom Overton has agreed, who's done a lot of things. If she's free, you should have her too.
I would agree. I think we should have all three of you guys. I think that would be a very interesting podcast.
It would be a great conversation.
Yeah, awesome. I think we'll do that. All right, then. Well, I want to thank you very much for the webinar today. I want to thank everybody that's attended as well. If you have any additional questions, please submit them to anh.marketing@balchem.com. The Real Science lecture series continues with educational topics each month, including the one next month on November 5th titled Amino Acid Nutrition for Maximizing Milk Components. And that'll be with Dr. Mike Van Amberg from Cornell University. Visit balchem.com/real science for details on future webinars and to register for upcoming events. Balchem's podcast series, The Real Science Exchange, continues to offer a deeper dive into our webinar topics. Log on to your favorite podcast platform and search for Real Science Exchange or visit balchem.com/podcast. And if you want a really cool Real Science Exchange t-shirt, just subscribe to the Real Science Exchange, send us a screenshot along with your address and shirt size to anh.marketing@balchem.com, and we'll get that off to you right away. On behalf of Balchem and Dr. Hernandez, thank you for joining us today.